All right, hey everybody, welcome. Tonight we're going to talk about must pre-treatments. So this would be everything that you could do to your grapes, right, before you officially start fermentation, right? For this, you can reference chapter 3 from Principles and Practices of Winemaking, and I also have a nice linked article here from Penn State University if you want. So before we get started, just a little bit of vocabulary. We talked about some of these words in our last presentation, but just in case, we have must, which is freshly crushed fruit juice that contains the skin, seeds, and sometimes the stems of the fruit. Tannin, extracted from seeds and skins of grape, are crucial in the longevity of the wine's shelf life, also are responsible for the drying mouth sensation when drinking a lot of red wines. Next, we have maceration. So in this process, used primarily in making red wine, involves steeping the grape skins and solids in the juice/wine to help extract those colors and flavors, right? So with that, we have a couple different types of maceration that you might hear winemakers commonly refer to. So there's a cold maceration, also known as a cold soak. This takes place before the fermentation. So you keep the must cold, you let it sit there, and then it extracts. It gives it longer time before the fermentation begins. Next, on the opposite side of that, we have an extended maceration, and this is where you leave the skins on the newly fermented wine after fermentation, and you actually get a different type of extraction because alcohol is the solvent in this case, whereas it was water before fermentation. Here you can extract colors, tannins, and aromas from the skin, aided by heat, the amount of skin contact, and time. So typically get more of that like tannin and mouthfeel from the extended maceration, but both a cold soak and an extended maceration can help enhance the color of your wine for sure. So a little bit of background, but we'll go ahead and we'll kind of dive into it. So for this presentation, we have two parts. We have a part 1, which involves cluster and berry sorting, crushing to stemming, and then direct to press processes. Next, we have part 2, which will include grape freezing, cryo-concentration, cryo-extraction, withering, cold soak, thermovinification, and saignée. I know we already talked about saignée in our last presentation, but I'm just grouping it in here because it is technically a pre-fermentation treatment. So, the more the merrier. Okay, so first we have cluster and berry sorting, right? This can happen in the vineyard or at the winery. It can happen at hand at a sorting table, which looks a lot like this picture in the bottom right. We have a couple of folks sitting or standing over the sorting table, and the sorting table will actually shake the fruit and kind of separate it on this table. Then you can look around the clusters and pick out any leaves, any twigs, any bugs, anything other than grapes, which we refer to as MOG, M-O-G, material other than grapes. So you have the sorting tables. This can happen in the vineyard as well. So as grape buckets or bins are being dumped into like a macro bin, or a larger container for transport back to the crush pad, sometimes there will be someone, standing there removing leaves or looking through it and like making sure it's clean as it goes in, right? Typically, we don't ask the pickers to sort through the fruit because they're on a time schedule. Sometimes they get paid by weight, so they're really just trying to get the job done while it's still cool enough outside so you can get the grapes in and start processing them right away. So that's another one. Another one that we have is by machine optical sorting. The optical sorter is really cool. I have a picture of it in the next slide, and I'll show you how that works. They're a very expensive piece of equipment as well. So why do we cluster or berry sort? This is because we want to increase the quality of the wine by removing any moldy clusters, vineyard critters, dirt clods, leaves, rocks, right? Anything like that is not necessarily going to add any positive characteristics to the wine, right? So we just want to make sure that we have as clean of a product as we can before we get into the processing and fermentation beginnings, right? Okay, so this is the process of an optical sorter, right? So we have fruit coming into the in-feed conveyor. As you can see, these little purple dots are the grapes. The little green dots would be like unripe, unfertilized grapes, and then the green stars would be like leaves, right? So it comes in through a conveyor. It goes down the conveyor where the optical sorter, the camera, is watching it visually, and then it coincides with these air jets that will release a puff of air and automatically like push out any unripe grapes or any leaves or any rejects, essentially, and it will let through the ripe grapes, the ones that did pass the optical test, and let that go into the crusher destemmer or into the other processing stages. So very cool piece of equipment. This is like the new thing. Well, it's been around for a while, but if you know a winery that has one, it's kind of like, it's like the neighbor with a nice new car in the driveway, right? You're like, that's a nice piece of equipment. That's very expensive, and not everyone can afford it, but it is very helpful, and it helps to streamline the process, right? Okay, next we have crusher and destemmers, right? Crushers and destemmers are used to have a better extraction of juice, better macerations of the skins. It's an opportunity to remove the stems and the rachis from the cluster. So it's the little pieces that hold the stem in place. Removed stems get collected and spread back out into the vineyard. They become compost. We use them as a form of organic matter to then till back into the soil and put those nutrients back into the dirt. So very common practice. Most everyone uses a crusher and destemmer. It looks a lot like this piece of equipment in the upper right. Our version of the class is much, much smaller, of course, but the process is very much the same. So, very helpful. Okay, diving into crushing and destemming, you can actually adjust the industrial crushers and destemmers. I don't think we can adjust ours, our home winemaker scale one, at least not that I'm aware of yet, into how much crushing you want it to do. So if you have whole berries in your fermentation and your tank, it's a slower fermentation. Slower fermentations typically result in more fruit-forward wines. If you have crushed berries, you've released all the juice and the sugar into the tank, so you'd have a faster fermentation. More heat would be produced because of the faster rate of consumption of sugar. And then you would have more color extraction from the skins. So, I mean, you kind of want a combination of like the perfect amount of fruitiness and color extraction, right? So some winemakers, or a lot of winemakers, will aim for about 10 to 30% of the berries to be whole during the crushing process in order to obtain a carbonic maceration effect, right? So that's the goal. And so how they adjust this on the crusher destemmer is there's a pair of screws, and it will adjust the width between these crushing rollers. So you can open them up slightly so that you have less of a crushing effect, or you can put them together even tighter so you have a higher crushing effect. And what winemakers I've worked for have done is they hold a paddle out underneath the crusher destemmer. They look at the grapes that are hitting the paddle, and they say, okay, it looks like approximately 30% or 50%, whatever your goal is, of these berries are still whole. So I can adjust it one way or the other, whatever you like most, which is kind of a fun thing. And then this is a picture of like the process of a crusher destemmer. So whole clusters would enter the machine. Ours at the school will crush them before it destems them, but most industrial crusher destemmers will destem first and then crush. So it goes into this chute where it enters this kind of a cylinder area with paddles inside. The paddles will push the fruit up against this grate with holes in it. The berries will be forced through the holes, and then the stems will be forced out the side and down into like a disposal container. Then the berries will fall down into this crushing section where these rollers will then crush them open. So that is the process. Okay, there are different types of crushers, right? There's the crusher destemmer that we commonly use in class that we are aware about, and if you work in the wine industry, you've probably seen, right? This will crush fruit and separate berries from the stems. This is a very sought after if you have stems that will impart negative flavor, right? Sometimes winemakers will keep the stems in a fermentation, and that does contribute flavors and aromas and mouthfeel. If your stems are underripe, it can contribute some bitter characteristics and some vegetal components, but it really depends on the style of wine that you're trying to do, right? On the other hand, we have a crusher and stem disintegrator. This will break up the stems with the berries, and then it's wanted when you want to impart the character of the stem, right? So if the stem is nice and ripe and woody, it could impart some like spice characteristics into your potential wine. Okay, then we have pressing, right? Pressing is used to recover juice or wine associated with the pulp, skins, and seeds that isn't released by the free run. You can separate press fractions to manipulate juice wine composition. So what that means is you have free run, and that's just the newly fermented wine or juice, depending on the stage that you press, that comes out of the press on its own freely. Then as you press, you're applying multiple stages of pressure, right? So you start your initial press and some wine or juice comes out. Then you start pressing harder and then more comes out. So every time you up the pressure in your pressing, you actually create press fractions, right? And the harder that you press, the more of the tannin and potential bitterness that you could be getting from the crushing of the skins and the seeds in the composition. So that's something to be aware of, right? When we work in the industrial side of pressing in the winemaking world, we have an automatic system that will apply a certain amount of pressure. It'll work on a time schedule. It'll actually, like, for pneumatic presses, it'll like deflate and then it will like roll the skins around and then reinflate to a certain pressure to get the most efficient yield out of that press. So pressing is important, right? So with that being said, there's different methods for pressing in addition to different types of presses. Something called direct to press is when you just put all the clusters from harvest into the press directly. So it just goes direct to press. This can help minimize extraction from the skin. It's typically used for white or rosé wines, right? It's also used to reduce and manipulate varietal character. So because you're removing the juice directly from the skins right at the beginning, you won't be extracting a lot of character from the skins themselves. That's the thought process. And here we have a couple different pictures. What we see here on the bottom is a very large basket press. This is a very old piece of equipment. You can see it's still wooden, and they have the grapes loaded in the center. Here on the right side, we have what's called a pneumatic press, which has half of it is like this industrial airbag that will inflate and deflate, and that'll push all the skins up against this grate here on the left side, and as it presses up against, all of the juice or newly fermented wine will come out that grate into a collection pan and be pumped into a new tank. Here is like the opening, the door for this pneumatic press. So it rolls upwards. You open these doors, you pour the grapes in, and then you can close the doors when you're ready to start operating. So cool. So here is just a like visual aid to the different types of press fractions that can come from pressing. So this is, think of this as like the press here, right? Where you load all the grapes in, and that's showing, okay, once we load the grapes in, we'll say about 50% of our total yield will just be free run juice. You won't even have to press or add any pressure. That's free run juice. We have 50%. Then our first press fraction is when we up the pressure to 0.2 bars. Then we receive about 30% more yield, right? And then we have our second press fraction, which has a maximum pressure of 2 bars. And the device knows to hold it at a certain amount of time, to rotate, to reinflate, and go from there. So from that, we get about 20% yield. So as you move along in the process, it's decreasing amounts of juice that you get, right? So the harder you press, you get less and less juice, and you extract more and more from the skins. So experience and proper winemaking skills, you'll know when to stop the press. Okay, here on the left, this is what free run juice looks like, right? It is considered the highest quality of juice. Press fractions after this are put into tiers based off of increasing pressure. That brings increasing bitterness for white wines. So you have to be very careful, right? Afterwards, all the skins that are left over are called grape pomace. So that is what the leftover skins are called after pressing. This is a picture of grape pomace after pressing whole clusters. You can still see the stems in here, but you can also see that some of these berries look very round. So we did not get a good yield from this picture. This was not pressed completely. There's a lot of juice left behind. And if you were working, if this was a business for you and your livelihood depended on it, this would be a very upsetting situation if you threw out these pomace into the vineyard, because you left probably 50% of what your potential juice yield could have been in the press, right? You just left it behind. So it would need to be typically a press when it's completed. When you're cleaning it out, it actually the grapes sound like, the skins sound like pebbles across the machine because they have been squeezed so tight they actually sound like they're almost a solid object. So, for your information. Okay, so you have a basket press, which is this wooden press here. This is the type of press that we have in class too, right? So it's like the traditional, very old school style press. It's been around forever, requires like little to no technology whatsoever. So this is really ideal for small volumes. You get low yields, right? And we've seen that in class, right? As we press, we'll press really hard, and then we get kind of like that birthday cake kind of look. But all of the grapes in the center of that birthday cake are still pretty much intact. Like it doesn't do a good job of pressing everything. It's not very efficient, right? So as a lower yield, but we do have low damage to skins and seeds. So we'll have minimal extraction from that. So we won't receive a lot of bitterness from a basket press, which is nice. It is difficult to get uniform pressing, like I mentioned. It also can be difficult to clean. Ours, because it's so small, is not difficult, but a larger one like this might pose a lot of issues, especially if it's very well used, like this picture. But that's just because wood components cannot be sanitized. So wood naturally is very porous. It has its own microbiome living in it, and if it were to become infected with something, say like Brett or VA, and we'll learn more about these faults in class as we go more into detail or more in depth, but it becomes very difficult to sanitize wood because once it becomes embedded with these things, it just exists. So it becomes very hard to sanitize wood, and most people would say you cannot because of the pores. Okay, next we have the cylindrical presses. So this is a lot like the press that we have at most wineries today. This is the most common one that you'll see. It looks just like a tank on wheels, and there's typically a collecting tray underneath it to receive the juice during the pressing time. So cylindrical presses include a piston, air bladder, and vacuum presses, right? They are easy to control, and they apply pressure uniformly, which is really nice. They also will elaborate pressing cycles and separation of different press fractions if you program them that way. They have a moderate yield, but they are somewhat difficult to clean. And there's a lot of safety involved with cleaning these too, because it is a confined space. You actually have to have a permit for entry. You have to do a lockout tagout safety procedure where the machine has to be unplugged, turned off first, unplugged. The key to turn on the machine needs to be on the operator that's cleaning it, right? Because once you enter this machine, once you're standing underneath it here, the only thing that's showing are your little feet at the end of the day, right? The last thing we want is someone to turn on this machine just to try to start operating it while you're inside. So there's a lot of safety concerns with wineries. Cleaning out presses is one of the safety concerns that we have to be very careful about for everyone's health and safety. So it does become difficult. Okay, so cylindrical presses includes a piston, an air bladder, and then juice comes out, right? So a piston would be parts that come together and press. Air bladder, the pneumatic presses, are the ones that I've commonly worked with where there's the bag inside that inflates to press the grapes. And then the juice comes out into a collecting pan, and then pumped into a tank. Okay, another type of press that you might see if you work at a very, very large industrial winery is called the screw press. This is also known as a dewatering press. It's actually used in many other industries as well, which is very interesting. I do have a picture on YouTube if you'd like to see it. This is a very high yielding press. It will have a very high amount of tissue damage, both skin and seeds, so it can give you more bitterness and astringency in your wines. Very high solids content of your juice. So this is like acting as a screw that just keeps crushing your grapes essentially and removing juices at the same time. The interesting thing about this is it has a continuous pressing action, so you don't need to wait for press load, so it is more time efficient. So in a very mass scale situation, I could see this being used. I cannot confirm or deny whether or not very large wineries like Gallo use this. I honestly don't know. I do know it exists, and I do know that it can be used, but it's very intense. Okay, so with our discussion about pressing, let's talk about some pressing aids. There are products that you can use to add to your press to increase the yield of your juice, right? So if you've ever worked with like white wines, especially grape varieties for white wines that are extremely pulpy, they become very hard to extract juice from because the pulp holds on to so much of the juice still. It becomes, you have a very bad yield, right? So you have options if this happens. And this includes pectic enzymes. So these are enzymes that will help to remove that juice from your solid product. Then there's rice hulls. You can easily buy rice hulls from your local feed store. They're very inexpensive. It provides like a solid surface for your grapes to be crushed up against to help that situation out as well, right? The enzymes are very helpful because the component that's holding on to the juice is a pectin. It's a jelly-like substance, and to break down that pectin, it's like the same stuff that's in literally jelly, right? It's pectin. To break it down, you can use this enzyme to release those juices. There are varieties that are just known to have high amounts of pectin and can be lots of issues, and that's Muscats, Riesling, and Sylvaner. There are other ones as well, but those are the big three that become problems in the industry. Okay, so moving out of the whole pressing thing, moving on to other types of pre-fermentation treatments. This one is pretty bizarre. This is must or grape freezing. So you can, if you have the resources and the power to do this at your facility, it's a very interesting process. It's done before fermentation, and you literally freeze the grapes or the must itself. The thought process or the advantage to this is that this will cause the skin cells of the berry to burst because water expands when it's frozen, right? So for this, they use dry ice, which is frozen carbon dioxide, to blanket the must and prevent it from oxidizing. The resulting wines will have higher tannin and higher anthocyanin extraction, so it's those colors and flavors. And it is a very expensive procedure, and there's very little research available on the subject. I don't know I have not worked for a winery that's utilized this. When I went to school at UC Davis, we did freeze the grapes that we were going to process, but that was because we had access to cold rooms that we could manipulate the temperature, and because by the time we got to the winemaking segment of our class, it was actually kind of past harvest. So we had these grapes that were, I'm assuming, donated that we needed to process as students. So that is how they like preserved them until we were ready to process them for class. Okay. Anthocyanins. Very fun. They are a type of plant pigment that's found in many foods and flowers. It's what gives red wine its color, right? In wine, it's associated with antioxidants and color stability, right? Antioxidants are fantastic because they fight free radicals. They're anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and anti-cancer, which is fun. There are different types of anthocyanins, and they're responsible for color of a lot of things in like fruit and flowers and nature. So here's a couple examples of different types of anthocyanins and the different colors they create. as well as their organic chemistry structure, which is really cool. So here we have cyanidin, which is responsible for dark red/pink colors. Then we have pelargonidin, I don't know how to pronounce that one, sorry, which is bright red/orange. Then delphinidin, which is blue and violet. So delphinidin, Delphi is a reference to dolphins, and so the blue makes sense. Okay, but the cool thing is if you look at the organic structure of these molecules, you'll see that they're very similar. They're basically the same except for these N groups on the right side. So you can see cyanidin has these OH, also known as hydroxyl groups. We have 2 on this benzene ring. For orange, we only have 1. And then for blue-violet, we actually have 3. So interesting to see how the color deepens. It goes from orange-red to blue/violet. You actually add more of those N groups onto that compound. So just that one tiny change in the structure, boom, you have a different color, which is amazing. Chemistry is fun. Okay, so moving on. So you can freeze grapes, right? But there's also a process. So freezing grapes/must will help by expanding the water content, and it will burst the cells, right? So you get an extraction. If you take the juice, just the juice, before fermentation, you put it into a tank, and you freeze that tank, you will effectively freeze the water before you freeze the sugar solution, right? So the water will be left behind. If you ever left a carton of non-fat milk in the fridge and it got too cold and it develops that like really awkward hunk of ice in it, that's the water portion, right? That's essentially what you're doing for juice in this situation, right? So this is a strategy you could use to increase the sugar content in your must, right? So you freeze it, it forms that block of ice that's basically pure water because it'll freeze first before the sugar solution will. Then as it's frozen, you pump out the juice, which is basically pure sucrose at this point, and that hunk of ice stays behind, and then you concentrate the juice, right? So this could be used to concentrate grapes diluted by rainy harvest. Freezing and thawing leads to tissue destruction, so better sugar extraction. This will also inhibit spoilage bacteria that may be present on the grapes, right? So extreme temperature, rather, even if it's freezing or extremely like boiling hot, that will disrupt the biota on the grapes, right? So interesting process. Again, really energy intensive, and not everyone has the luxury of doing this, right? Okay, another way that you can concentrate the amount of sugars in your fruit before fermentation is a process of withering of the grape berries. This is common in parts of Italy. It is known as a passamento, and this is where they'll pick the clusters and then they'll put them in a rack, or they'll even hang them to dry until the desired sugar content is reached. So this will concentrate the sugars. It's a very expensive procedure and very time intensive. It can take anywhere from 1 to 4 months. So it's pretty intense. Just think about how much work it takes to harvest the grapes, let alone very carefully sort through them, put them on trays or hang them up on racks for them to dry out, just for you to take them off those trays or racks to ferment later. So it's pretty crazy, but it looks like a very cool process. Okay, next we have pre-fermentation cold soak. We talked about this as like a vocabulary word at the beginning of this presentation. This is a way to enhance the extraction of color and flavor from grape skins. It can bring out beneficial and different aromas and flavors than those extracted during fermentation. The nice thing about a cold soak is that it will minimize the bitterness and it will actually lower the acidity of your resulting wine. So you think about the difference between cold brew versus hot brewed coffee. Cold brew is a very similar situation. It has more caffeine because you're not cooking it out basically with the hot water. It's smoother, it's less bitter. So cold brew is actually an excellent example of what a cold soak does to grapes versus just the hot fermentation. So cold soaks are very nice. I would not recommend doing a cold soak though if your fruit doesn't already come in cold. So if you harvest, the fruit is hot, it's coming in. If you attempt to do a cold soak, it's just going to ferment on its own, because when it's a large amount of fruit in a tank, the center of that tank is going to be hot because the fruit came in hot. And even if you apply a cooling jacket and dry ice, it's just going to take off on its own. So be wary of a cold soak. If you can bring in the fruit cold and keep it cold, add SO2 to prevent it from fermenting, use the dry ice, then you should be in a good spot. Also, I wouldn't recommend, just from my experience, doing a cold soak for more than like 3 days. After 3 days, you're most likely going to see it starts to ferment on its own. And unless you want a native fermentation, then you have to be careful, right? So do some research about that. Okay, so here we have some data from pre-fermentation cold soak. And this was for Chenin Blanc, which is a white grape variety. So we have a couple of different wines that were made here, right? So we have the Control, and the Control had flavors of banana, pineapple, passion fruit, and mint, interestingly enough. So that's in red here, the Control. And what this is a plot that shows an axis of different wines, but also like different flavors and aromas. So it plots like the intensity of these things. So it's a way to map out this information, right? So it's a biplot. So next wine we had was fermentation on skins, and that is in blue here. So fermentation on skins, we had astringent, raisin, honey, and marmalade. We also had like dry grass, bitter, as descriptors of this wine. And so this was kind of, these are negative components, right? They weren't very positive to the person tasting it, and they were somewhat intense, right, on this plot. So the farther out you are, the more the intensity of it is. Next, we had skin contact before fermentation, so aka a cold soak. And these are all the same grape variety. And for this, we have stone fruit, cooked vegetable, and yellow apple, which is really interesting, right? Dried fruit, stone fruit, yellow apple, cooked vegetable components. So that is the difference there. Okay, similarly, a sensory profile was created for Gewürztraminer, and what we see here is this is like a spider web kind of map where descriptors are given to wines and then it's plotted by intensity. So at the very center, this would be 0, right? And then as you go out farther, like in width, no matter where you are on this plot, it would be more intense, right? So it's a relative plotting. So in the green, we have the Control, right? So this was just a regular white wine. We did it the standard way, right? And then for the pink circle, the pink plot, we have whole cluster pressing. We saw with whole cluster pressing, we got a little more apple and maybe a little more passion fruit. But it was also a little more sour, less bitter, and it was a little more fruity in the mouth, right? So that was an interesting one. However, when we get to the 24-hour skin contact with the addition of an enzyme to help extract those flavors better, you can see this yellow plot is way more intense and shows way more character than the other two. So for the yellow plot, we have much more apple, passion fruit, clove, caramel, rose blossom, had less hay, less sour, maybe slightly more bitter. It was less fruity by mouth, but it was way more floral by mouth, and it had more body. So very interesting show of events, what happens when you process Gewürztraminer in different ways. And this was just one step of the winemaking process out of the 100 decisions you have to make basically when you make a wine. So just this one step can make a very, very big difference. Okay, cold soaking for reds, right? So this is typically, the process would be holding the must at a low temperature, so less than 50 degrees, before fermentation to encourage slow and soft extraction of color and flavors from the grape skins. A little repetitive, but just to make sure you guys get the point, it provides a head start on color and flavor extraction, Can take anywhere from 3 to 10 days. Again, I would not recommend the 10 days. If you have the equipment and the ability to do it, it's wonderful, but it can be very expensive. You're going to be paying for dry ice to be put on that for 10 days. And also you have to store that wine, and you'd have to be able to have the luxury of storing that wine in the same tank for that long of the cold soak and then the resulting fermentation to do that, to pull that off, right? So this can be done with varieties that are low in color, such as like Pinot Noir. And this will also enable bloom of non-Saccharomyces yeast, which can be positive or negative, right? So any native yeast or bacteria that came in on that fruit is going to start blooming. It's going to start growing, and whether you trust the biota of your vineyard and winery or not will make a big difference. So you can be very successful with native fermentations if you have the right biota and your winery is clean, right? Okay, so here we go. This is a picture of dry ice in a macro bin where it is cold soaking before fermentation. Okay, here's just a graphic from Wine Folly showing cold soak. So at this point we have the grape juice, seeds, and skins in the tank. It's very cold. The resulting wine will have a darker color without the tannin extraction, right? Okay, so we talked about cold soak, freezing. Now the opposite part of that spectrum is thermovinification, right? So this would be you expose the must to extremely high temperature for a short amount of time. So this is a pre-fermentation process of heating whole or crushed grapes to promote rapid extraction of phenolic compounds from grape skins, particularly color compounds in grapes to make red wine. So think of tea brewing, right? So you add boiling hot water to your tea. It helps to extract the flavors and aromas and color from the tea leaves, and it's a very quick process. It doesn't take long for you to start seeing those colors being extracted. So this is a common piece of equipment you would see for thermovinification. It includes all of these tubes that go back and forth, and these would basically have a glycol system on the outer portion of it that would be extremely hot temperature, so that way the wine pumping through the tubes can heat up very quickly, or the must, right? So you'd crush into stem, pump it through these tubes at very hot temperatures for a short time, right? So the resulting of this thermovinification is you actually kind of sterilize your must, if that makes sense. So it's a very hot flash that comes through. It will kill any biota that's on the must. It will also denature any enzymes that can cause browning in the wine. You will get an increase in color extraction, increase of phenolics, so you could have taste, color, mouthfeel components. It's also easier to press because it's been slightly cooked, right? And you will also have a huge change in the flavors that are expressed in the wine. Okay, thermovinification setup, how this process would look, right? So you would take your cold must, and you could do thermovinification for 60 degrees for 2 minutes, or you do thermovinification for 87 degrees Celsius for 2 minutes. Then the must needs to be cooled. Then it goes into a tank where it macerates. It sits with those skins from 0 to 12 hours. You could do with or without enzymes to help extract even more flavors and aromas. Then it gets pressed. Then you just ferment the red juice at 24 degrees Celsius. So the reason that we're not necessarily fermenting on the skins in this situation is because you have already blasted it with heat, extracted a bunch of components from the skins and seeds, and so we don't want to over extract or bring out too much tannin or bitterness, so we actually need to remove it from the skins. This could be super helpful if you don't have an open tank to ferment in, if you only have closed tanks and you don't have the ability to load it with must, only with liquid wine. This could be a process for a quick turnover of tanks for that style. So Very interesting. So let's look at the sensory changes of thermovinification. So this is for Dornfelder, which is a German red variety, was the experiment here. So here we see skin maceration versus thermovinification. So we had two replicas of this experiment, and 16 judges took part in this. And we see the spiderweb diagram again for this, showing the components of wine that they tasted and the intensity of them. So first we have thermovinification at 87 degrees Celsius. So this was blasted with heat, and then it followed the process we talked about in the last slide. So flavors and aromas that were associated with this were cassis, which is black currant. Then we have cherry, strawberry, rosemary, spicy, not as smoky as the other one, sour, less astringent, less bitter, but more body, and just about the same amount of color. So very interesting aromas, and also advantageous for not as much bitterness, right? On the other hand, for the green plot, we see a fermentation on the skins for 8 days. And this is just the basic generic, ferment, drain, press situation that we see on a day-to-day in the industry. So this wine was scored completely different. It had less fruit, right? So less black currant, cherry, strawberry, had more vegetal character, so more green bell pepper, less rosemary, less spicy, more smoky, about the same amount of sour, more astringent, more bitter, and a little bit less body, but same amount of color. So as you can see, just this process can give you a completely different wine at the end, right? So this is where, if you want to become a winemaker, knowing how you can manipulate the fruit or care for the fruit, process it, and how it will result and what it will give you as an end product is extremely, extremely helpful. Okay, and we've talked about this before, the Saignée, right? We remove free-run juice before fermentation. We get a rosé and a more intensely colored red wine as a product of this, right? Some research was done, and 5 to 18% removal of juice was easy. Anything between 25 to 32 was very difficult because you just had so much skins in comparison to the liquid ratio that you had, that the must becomes very hard to manage at that point. So, food for thought. And then we have our Saignée Rosé picture and our review questions. So, we've kind of gone through the basics of winemaking in this class at this point, and now we're kind of getting into all of the exceptions to the rules, right? We've talked about how wine is made, the different styles, when it's harvested, right? And now we just talked about pre-fermentation treatments. Our next presentation will be treatments to the juice. Then we have just primary fermentation, all the different types of primary fermentation. Then we're going to learn about all the types of secondary fermentation, all the things you could do. So as we go on to this class, you'll see just how nuanced and complicated it can be sometimes, but also, with that being said, all of the possibilities that could be expressed in winemaking as well. So it's a very fun class to be in. I enjoy teaching this class. So that's kind of the direction that we're heading. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.